In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was going through a political transformation. Empires and kingdoms that had once been very loosely controlled by leaders came to consolidate their power, and suddenly monarchs and empires were actually the true leaders of their countries. This didn't happen everywhere, but it happened in a number of some of the major countries that would later be Europe's great powers. Now, there are exceptions in some places, and we'll talk about those as well. But we're first going to look at these places that are known as Renaissance monarchies. Now, just to be clear, these are not monarchies that have anything really to do with the Renaissance itself. They're not like part of the intellectual and cultural advancements of the Renaissance. It's just basically by time period that gives them this title, Renaissance monarchies. So first, let's take a look at what's going on in Europe before these Renaissance monarchies take over. If you recognize this from 7th grade history, and of course, I'm sure you do, you might see it's slightly different than what is normally put out there, but this is the hierarchy that represents the political, economic, and social structure of Europe during the Middle Ages. This is the feudal system, and the feudal system was basically a system set up where those above provided something for those below, and those below, in turn, had to provide something to those above, always with the knowledge that there was a very strict hierarchy of who was in charge. So when you look at this, monarchs, kings and emperors around Europe, sat at the top of this hierarchy. Below them were other landowners, wealthy, powerful landowners, the nobility or aristocracy. That's kind of important to know that monarchs actually came from this place. So they are not, they at one point were nobles themselves, but they were able to get enough support and power to kind of be the head of all nobility. Below the nobles were other smaller landholders, knights and vassals. And then down at the bottom, this particular hierarchy separates them, but in truth, most of the time, you'll just say them all clumped together. Merchants, farmers, craftsmen, peasants, serfs. This is 97% of the population of Europe. They are the people who, if they own any land, it's very small plots of land. A small group of skilled artisans, merchants, lawyers, doctors, professionals. But most of this group was made up of peasants and serfs, the people who worked on the land, toiled on the land, and basically grew all the food and did most of the labor for everybody above them. So how did this system come to be? Well, and also we don't want to forget that the Catholic Church, being as powerful it was, always posed somewhat of a challenge to the authority of the higher ranking people in this hierarchy. The Pope, for instance, most popes often saw themselves as above monarchs, and most monarchs saw themselves as having more authority than popes. So there's a great deal of tension there. And then some nobles were basically the equals of some of the higher ranking clergy, like bishops and archbishops. So why did this come to be? So here we've got a map of France. Now, I'm not going to divide France up into any actual particularly real provinces or anything. I just wanted to use this to kind of illustrate why the feudal system came to be. So imagine you are the monarch, the king of France. You control this entire huge kingdom. Now, without the kind of modern transportation and communication, military skills and things that we have today, this would be impossible to control as a 15th or 16th century leader. So monarchs did what they felt to would be the most efficient thing to maintain their control over their kingdom. They looked to the nobility, those who were somewhat equal to them, and people who served them, people who had served them in the military, people who had served them in their courts. And what they did was they would divide up their huge kingdom into these smaller areas. And I'm just going to do random ones. There's nothing, actually, I don't think true about these, but let's say the king kept this section for himself. Everything else was divided up among his nobility. All right, so here we've got France all chopped up into these smaller provinces, the king controlling one large one, his nobility technically watching over the rest of this land and promising to care for it and protect him from invaders and help him and defend him if needed. So let's say I'm a nobleman who controls all of this territory in the southern part of France. This is still a very large piece of property. So to enable me to control this land and protect it, I'm going to do the same thing that my king did. I'm going to divide it up as well into smaller pieces. I might keep a large swath of it for myself. It's important to remember that at this point in history, land completely equals wealth. The most important thing economically for all people in Europe throughout the Middle Ages was to get enough food to eat. That was essential. And you couldn't go anywhere else, you couldn't do anything else without the basic essentials. So land becomes an absolute necessity and incredibly valuable. So if I'm the noble here, I've got my vassals and my knights who control these sections, and they in turn might even divide that land up even more in order to defend it and protect it. Now, the issue here is how much power does a king really have when what they've done is divided up their property into all these smaller pieces? Do they really control all of these parts of their kingdom, or have they really just turned control over to these nobility? And the truth is, in most cases throughout the Middle Ages, the latter was more true. You didn't really, as a king or emperor, control your country. You relied on your nobility and your vassals to help protect you and defend you. If they turned on you or if they refused to support you, you could not hold on to your kingdom. So that created a great deal of instability. And as kings and monarchs were working their way through into the 14th, 15th centuries, they began to see the need for figuring out a way to really consolidate power, to make it so they didn't have to count on all these others. So what changed? What changed was that kings and monarchs, emperors, found ways to do the absolute necessary things to control their own kingdom. They needed to find a way to exist without having to count on their nobility. One way was to make sure you could collect your own taxes and your own money. Having your own money and not having to count on nobles to collect taxes and money for you meant that you could collect all of it. Having middlemen collect taxes for you usually meant they got some of the money. So you had to allow for them, you had to find a way to keep them from having the ability to take some of your dues and your money. Also, kings and monarchs needed to figure out how to build their own armies. Now, granted, that was going to take money. So first they had to figure out how to collect that money. Once they did collect that money and were able to create their own armies, collecting taxes and money was going to be a lot easier for them because they had kind of a police force, in a sense, to do the job. Another thing that would change is that kind of a jealousy and competition began to grow as towns and cities started to pop up in parts of Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. Uh, Monarchs found ways to kind of utilize the jealousy that was growing between the wealthy, powerful landowners and some of these increasingly wealthy and powerful people who lived in towns and cities. Uh, these nobility, the landowners, they had all sorts of privileges and benefits that even the wealthiest people in cities didn't have. And there was certainly a kind of competition growing between the two. The city and town dwellers had no real interest in listening to nobles and people uh, who technically controlled the land on which their city sat. Well, monarchs figured out a way to favor those who lived in cities and towns and to create a kind of jealousy that, in a sense, started this whole kind of anti-aristocratic sentiment throughout much of Europe. This helped a lot of monarchs to gain respect from other people, the city and town dwellers, and it also, that respect kind of transferred into being viewed as the actual ruler of their country, not just some figurehead. So when we look at some of the countries that were able to do this, we'll start with France. Now, throughout the Hundred Years' War, if you remember that conflict that existed between France and England in the 14th and 15th century, the French government had been consolidating more and more power as people began to come up with a greater sense of patriotism and national identity. The longer this war dragged out, the more the people who lived within the kingdoms of France began to view themselves not as people who lived under one nobleman or under some vassal in some little corner of the country, but they started to see themselves as one united French citizenry. That helped the king because once people started to have this kind of patriotism toward France, the king found ways to associate themselves with kind of being the face of France. So that patriotism, that respect of country, soon became kind of a respect and patriotism toward the monarch. Now, financially, the king was able to kings were able to reinstate this thing called the taille, which was a land tax, which was collected directly by kings. There were no middleman. You didn't send your nobles out to collect this for you, because were they to do that, they would take a percentage of it for themselves. Instead, you collected it directly, and it came directly to your coffers. And one of the most famous of the kings to consolidate power would be Louis XI, who we see an image of here. He continued this process and was not perfectly able to control his nobility, but he built up a large enough army, gained enough power and respect from the people that he could suppress too many challenges from his nobles. His biggest mistake would have been the fact that he could not keep his hands off of the Italian peninsula. Most of you probably earlier studied some information about politics on the Italian peninsula between the city-states in the Renaissance. France was constantly involved in those city-states, attacking, trying to take over, getting involved in alliances. That actually slowed down the process of France's monarchy becoming more powerful. England, also the other combatant in the Hundred Years' War, also kind of came out of this conflict with a little bit of unrest. After all this time, after all the resources spent, England never really got all that it wanted out of that war. People weren't happy about that. And there was a great economic crisis. In all this turmoil, civil war broke out between the House of Lancaster and the House of Lords. Since each of those houses had on their emblem a rose, one white, one red, this became known as the War of the Roses. The House of Lancaster, under the power of the Tudor family, ends up winning this civil war. And its first king, Henry VII, recognizes that it's essential that as the new monarch, he needs to have real power over England. To do that, he needs to control his nobility. Now, the first thing he does is he goes to the nobles, reminds them of what these decades and decades of violence have done to the countryside, to the people, to the wealth of England, how it's destroyed things. And he reminds these nobles that one of the reasons this war kept going on and on and on was that the nobility had been allowed to maintain private armies where the king was not allowed to do so. So he suggests a policy that says nobles can no longer have these private armies. Well, certainly if you're a noble, you feel a little bit like you've had something taken away from you, but the king is making good sense. By having these armies around, it seemed to lead to endless violence. So the nobles agreed to this. The next step Henry takes is, once again, using the nobility's distrust for one another, he creates something called the Court of Star Chamber. Now, England was one of the first places to have trial by jury and civil courts where people had certain rights. The problem in these courts was that, let's say you were a powerful nobleman and you had clearly committed a crime. When you went before these courts, juries sat down and saw who you were. And either through threat or bribery or something, that powerful nobleman would probably get off without being punished. Henry reminds the nobility that this is what's going on, that there are corrupt nobles out there who are taking advantage of this, of their power, and basically getting themselves off of any crime. So he says, I want to establish this court where there are no juries, where the only people that hear the trial are me and my advisors, and we dish out the punishment as well. That Court of Star Chamber went from being a seemingly good idea to ensure that corruption was lowered to basically a way for the king to threaten nobles if he didn't like what they were doing, even if it wasn't illegal. Probably the most successful of 15th and 16th century monarchies was in Spain. Now, they consolidated the power over the Iberian Peninsula in such a way that made them the true European power of the 16th century. Now, two royal families, one from Castile and one from Aragon, planned the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand. Now, they had to get special dispensation from the Pope to do this because they were too closely related to be married. And in fact, there was a fear on both their parts that they wouldn't be allowed to get married and that the political unity of Aragon and Castile would never happen. So the two actually snuck out and basically eloped. It didn't really have anything to do with romantic feelings for one another so much as they recognized the great victory that could come from combining Aragon and Castile. Once they combined these two great kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula, they then proceeded to take full control of the area. First, they removed nobility from the royal councils and replaced them with this growing group of middle-class lawyers and professionals and intellects who probably came from the humanist movement during the Renaissance. Then they built up an army that was controlled solely by the monarchy. They no longer needed to call upon their nobility to send soldiers in case there was some kind of fighting. They then chose to use something that all the people of Spain, or most of the people of Spain, already had faith in. They tried to use the power of the church to actually boost their power. That meant a little bit of finagling against the Pope, probably some kind of bargaining and compromise, but they eventually got the power to choose the most powerful clergy within Spain. They then went on to expel all non-Christians from the Iberian Peninsula. Both Muslims and Jews, of which there were quite a few, were forced out of Spain. Some were executed, some converted, but were seldom actually trusted because people felt that they never gave up their old ways. And then to further strengthen their power over the peninsula, they extended the power of the Inquisition, which was the traveling religious court that went around looking for anybody who they considered a heretic, someone who challenged the church. This became a way of threatening and intimidating people. Now, there are some places that failed to have this consolidation of power. And the greatest example would be the Holy Roman Empire. The empire was growing constantly throughout the later Middle Ages, largely due to the work of the Habsburg family of Austria, which controlled the empire. They expanded their territories through alliances and marriage. They didn't do so through war, fighting, and domination. So many of the territories that they collected within their empire were very loosely part of this empire. The joke always goes that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And that part about not being an empire was true. There were German states, there was the Netherlands, there were parts of old French territories, which all created a problem with the French. Switzerland, they had basically a territory ranging all the way from the Baltic Sea down to Italy. But it was only an empire in name. And very few, especially of those German princes, the people who lived in their little principalities, had true loyalty to the emperor. In fact, Germanic leaders spent most of their time trying to maintain their independence over their land, although they still claimed in theory to have allegiance to the emperor. Just so you get an idea of how divided this empire really was, here's a map. It's simply too large of a place for any one emperor to control. And it's too divided up. Every one of these, and there are more, but every one of these names you see is basically a semi-autonomous, partially independent little principality or kingdom or bishopric or free city. They had all sorts of places where the leader there felt like he was in charge, not really the emperor. And just for some more evidence of how weak this emperor was, in the 14th century, a decree was passed by the emperor called the Golden Bull. And it gave the power of electing the emperor to the leaders of 7 of the largest states within the empire. Now, I think most of us would stop and wonder, how powerful can a king or an emperor be if they actually have to be elected? I mean, that's part of the benefit of being a king or an emperor. No one gets to choose you. You are chosen by your bloodline. Another failure, Poland, an example of a few of the Eastern European powers that would not really consolidate under a single monarchy. The Polish nobility had the same problem that lots of nobilities in Europe had. They didn't trust one another. And they decided that probably the safest thing to do, since they didn't trust one another, was they would together select kings. But they would never select kings from within their own nobility. They would look outside of Poland and basically select from a royal family in Germany or someplace else and put them at the head of Poland. Now, right away, when you've got a king who's just been placed there by nobles and is not even really Polish, there's not a real interest in that king to defend, protect, or help to build up Poland. They also created something called the Sejm, which was kind of like a parliament. It was a council of nobles that came together to make decisions for the country. In that sense, they had power much like a king would have power. The problem was that this sim, which could have developed into a really strong parliamentary system, was completely ineffective. There was a rule called the liberum veto. It allowed a member, any one member, to veto a proposal that the entire sim had come up with. So one person could simply vote down an idea that might have been a good idea, and it would not come to be. They could even call off the entire meeting of the sim. Just one person could call it off, and they would disband. This created a very weak and indecisive government, and it creates a Poland that, as we go through this year, you will find disappears and reappears on the map of Europe whenever other powerful countries around them feel like taking them over or letting them be independent. So what do we learn from this? Basically, countries where power was consolidated under one powerful monarch tended to be successful. If you look at these three countries, the great power of Europe in the 16th century, the great power of Europe in the 17th century, the great power of Europe in the 18th and 19th century, countries where monarchs weren't able to consolidate power struggled and often were at the whim of internal problems and from attacks from the outside. It's not going to be coincidence that it's within the Holy Roman Empire and the German states where the first big challenge against the Catholic Church is successful. So these Renaissance monarchies are clearly creating a new political scene in Europe. And we'll watch later on as we go through the next few units as these countries, Spain, France, and England, gain power and become more and more influential.